The young deputy stood waiting for me, apparently hoping for a human reaction. I think I mumbled something unintelligible when he handed me a clipboard to sign after saying those rather unpleasant words. "Mr. Nathan Becker, you have been served. Please sign the acknowledgement." A few swipes of blue ink and a look into his squinting brown eyes, and I was done. He turned and left me standing with a white envelope in my hand on the doorstep of the apartment I now called home. There were still boxes in the corners of each of the rooms, and a few bags of items bought from a few local stores were ready to appear throughout the apartment to give it some functionality. This first night had been in preparation for months. I just didn't realize it until the albatross caught up with me. Mrs. Becker disappeared with all the trappings of a decent marriage and commitment before pouncing on me with rejection and rejection on the way to my current abode. It was a quick drive, a half-mile in the other direction from what used to be home. When I returned from a business trip to Atlanta to meet with a new client, all my personal belongings were neatly stacked in the garage, and a handwritten note lay on one of the boxes. The lawyers will decide the rest. No signature, nothing. When I tried to put the key in the locks, they wouldn't open. The windows were closed, the basement entrance was locked, and I was clearly outside. No one was home, and if I had been wandering around Jupiter, everything would have been as familiar as what I was feeling at that moment. Michelle and I had been fighting more often than usual over the past couple of months, and I had even broached the subject of couples counseling, but to no avail. I guess I didn't blame her for that, since neither of us had thought about counselors at all. She was angry with me when I left and apparently continued to be angry, and so much so that she decided to pull a marital coup and kick me out. The first call to her cell phone went unanswered. The next call to her workplace went to her secretary, who informed me that Michelle was away on a business trip and would not be reachable until her return. Of course, she told me this after I introduced myself. She offered to take my message, and that was the end of it. 15 minutes later, I received a message from Michelle. "Consider yourself divorced." "Of course I do. As soon as I find out where you live, I'll send you to court right away. Stay away from my house." It was cold. It was Wednesday, and I needed somewhere to live. The house definitely belonged to her. She had gotten it when we got married, as a trophy after the first divorce. I think it was good for both of us. My first marriage had ended badly, and in the time between marriages I had learned not to get burned again, if at all possible. So when Michelle suggested a prenup to protect her assets, I did the same for mine. This included my consulting business and stakes in various other businesses. One of those businesses included 2 small condominiums registered to the consulting firm, and it just so happened that they had 4 vacant units. I chose one of the vacant furnished apartments as my temporary home, and by evening, everything in the garage was in its new abode. Utilities were already hooked up in the company's name, and the first thing I did was text Michelle, letting her know my new address. Then I closed the door and headed to the pub on the corner to share my problems with my favorite bartender. It was a familiar place to me since my office was only a block away from the apartment building and the corner pub. "I'd say you look like shit, Nathan, but you'll prove me a liar. You look as good as ever." Jeanette was another victim of divorce. For 3 years, she had been trying to survive by opening her own pub in a thriving midtown neighborhood. Things were going well so far, but the divorce didn't do her any good. Her husband took everything of value and left for the West Coast with his secretary, who turned out to be 20 years younger than him and 2 sizes larger than Jeanette. Eventually, she decided to buy the pub, having inherited it from her father when he passed away 2 years ago. "You say that every time I come here, Jeanette, but I never get tired of hearing it." She poured the IPA into a tall pint glass and set it in front of me. "So what's new?" "Michelle is divorcing me." "Are you kidding me? When did that happen?" "I got back from Atlanta this afternoon. She packed all my stuff into the garage and left town on business." "What the hell? She was here last night." "She came with the crew she works with downtown, and one of the guys in the group was buying drinks for all of them, like they were celebrating something. I thought they looked a little cozy." Now I was getting curious. Michelle never went to a pub unless she was with me. She was more into wine bars like most of her peers. The exception was Dan Mosey, her boss. He'd shown interest in the place even before Jeanette bought it, and considered himself somewhat of a beer connoisseur. If they all came here, it was only at Dan's suggestion. That guy with Michelle who was shopping, the red-haired, tall, blue-eyed, arrogant asshole? Damn, you described him exactly. He was a lousy tipper. She laughed. I'd seen him before at one of the corporate events, and I'd always taken him for a wimp. Something about him repulsed me, but Michelle thought and acted like he was God's gift to the company and the women. Still, there was no evidence or outward signs that there was anything between them, and practically speaking, I trusted Michelle. I had no reason not to trust back then. Picking up the phone, I dialed Michelle's office number and, getting an automated directory, dialed Mosey and got two choices, Caroline Mosey and Daniel Mosey. Caroline was his wife and worked in HR. I pressed 2 to dial Dan's office phone number. Hello, this is Dan Mosey from Hawthorne Financials. I will be out of the office until Monday morning. Please leave a message and I will get back to you as soon as possible. I sent an email to Michelle's work account. The response was expected. I will be out of the office until Monday morning. Please contact Cheryl Griggs with any issues that need immediate attention. Nathan, what are you doing? Jeanette asked with a smirk. Asked Jeanette 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 with a smirk. Looking and seeing. I opened the mapping app on my phone, dialed Michelle's number, and did a search. 10 seconds later, it showed her at the Pierpoint Dunes Hotel, an hour south along the beaches. Let me borrow your phone, Jeanette. She held it out to me and I dialed the hotel number. Dan Mosey's number, please. Who's calling? Hawthorne Financials, they're expecting a call. The operator connected me to his number. Good guess. On the third ring, the receiver was picked up. Hello? I thought about answering for a moment, but after glancing at Jeanette, I ended the call. Michelle had answered the phone from Dan Mosey's room at 11:05. That left no doubt. The next call was easier. I called the information desk to get the number and asked to be connected. Hello? Mrs. Caroline Mosey? She answered in the affirmative. I'm sorry to bother you at this hour, but my name is Nathan Becker. I believe we've met a couple times before at corporate events. Yes, Mr. Becker. I know your wife Michelle from work. What can I do for you? Well, I hate to tell you this, but I think you have a right to know. My wife has informed me that she is divorcing me, and I assume she is, but I also learned tonight that Michelle and your husband Dan are having an affair and are currently both living together at the Pierpoint Dunes Hotel on the beach. I believe we had a corporate retreat there a couple years ago. Are you sure, Mr. Becker? Dan told me he has a meeting with a client this week. Mrs. Mosey, I know my wife answered the room phone a few minutes ago when I was connected to his room. I haven't called yet, but I think if I had asked for Michelle Becker's room, he wouldn't have been there. That son of a bitch, I'm so sorry, Mr. Becker. It looks like Mrs. Mosey is going for a ride at this early hour of the night to see what Mr. Mosey is up to. I offered to drive her there myself, but she declined, and we politely ended the conversation, promising to stay in touch and keep each other informed. Jeanette, that concludes my conversation. Said, when are you going to invite me over to see your new apartment? She grinned. I replied that I would soon as I got it in order. I walked towards my apartment thinking more about Jeanette than my ex-wife. She was quite attractive, unlike the ever-businesslike Michelle. I walked in and turned on the lamp to look around the apartment. It could have been worse, I thought as I sank down on the unmade bed. The next morning after calling work, the receptionist filled me in on what had happened since I left. There was only one call in my messages that interested me, and it wasn't one of the 4 calls from Michelle, but a call from Caroline Mosey. She arrived at the hotel around 2 in the morning and let me into my room using a card obtained at the front desk. The hotel staff offered no resistance when she showed them her ID as Dan's wife. Dan and Michelle had clearly been drinking and partying, and in a drunken frenzy, they just sat there while Caroline took a rapid flurry of pictures on her cell phone. Once finished, she booked a private room for herself and returned later that morning. I ignored Michelle's calls, and a deputy came in the evening. I didn't shed a single tear over the whole thing. Instead, I was filled with anger at the prospect of wasting 5 years of marriage on a man who would callously throw it all away. I guess I still loved that miserable bitch, despite her cuckoldry and the fury with which she'd started the whole sneaky mess. Of course, that wouldn't have been much of a balm to assuage the resentment. Michelle is a smart woman, but she has enough stupidity in her to bring her down to the level of her gut. She has her own house, her own 401k, and her own bank account, but she's never understood what I've been building for years, before our marriage and after. The prenup spelled everything out for each of us on a surface level, but she never looked for or understood the details. Becker Consulting earned its credibility stripes when I was still walking around in ripped jeans and t-shirts. My father founded the company after 20 years in the oil and exploration industry, particularly in engineering. We are a little-known company. If you haven't worked in engineering consulting, you will never hear of us. But that doesn't mean we don't have influence. I took over the company 12 years ago, and 3 years after that, the company got caught in the economic maelstrom of 2007 to 2008, and we almost went bankrupt. We managed to hold on to about a third of the business and retain a few dedicated employees, but it was a sign that the model needed to change. At the same time, I went through a very nasty divorce. I lost both my home and the cabin in the mountains where we vacationed in the summer. My first wife, Janet, gained custody of our 13-year-old daughter, along with alimony, child support, and the wrath of most of our friends directed at me. The reason was pretty simple. I had gotten drunk at a company party and ended up passed out in the hotel room of one of the company's clients, a 42-year-old Spanish woman who had been harassing me since the beginning of our business. Someone had alerted Janet to my whereabouts, and at 3 in the morning she was standing over the bed, watching a snoring naked man with a black-haired Spanish beauty slung over his stomach. I have no idea if I was entertaining her or if we both just passed out, but it led to an unforgivable storm. Janet filed for divorce the next day, and for the next 6 months I lived in a construction trailer. She stopped talking to me, even when we had to sit within a few seats of each other at our daughter's high school graduation. I tried to talk to her, but her second husband would intervene. Nathan, she absolutely refuses to even acknowledge you. I don't understand that, but that's her business. I'm just sending a message. Carl wasn't the bad guy in all of this. He was just caught up in the hatred Janet still had for me even 4 years after the divorce. I simply thanked him, shook his hand, and turned my attention to whatever time my daughter could still give me that evening. 3 weeks later, Carl was killed in an accident at the factory where he worked. To be honest, I was very worried about it and still am sometimes. He really wasn't a bad guy. He just fell in love with a woman I once loved and was a good foster father to my daughter. I sent a personal flower arrangement and through my daughter offered any help I could. I never heard anything back. Looking back, I think it was the end of 2009 or so when the sun shone again in my life and the life of the company. We started getting contracts for new business, and I was able to start hiring new employees. The first thing I did was sit down at a table with my sister, the CFO, and started planning investments and diversification. Dad always put everything into the company, Nathan. Why would you change that now that we're starting to get back on our feet? Sis, you should already know the answer to that question. If we had the sense to expand our investable funds a bit, we could have come out of this better than we are now. I want to move the profits into a more diversified portfolio. Let's buy some real estate, maybe some undeveloped land, maybe some housing. That's what we did. Real estate led us to financial services, and that's how Becker Consulting became a 55% owner of Hawthorne Financials. They were acquired through a holding company, Carolina Capital, when they were worth a third of what they are today. 2009 to 2010 was a great time to buy anything related to real estate and finance. Carolina Capital, in turn, was separated from Becker with an additional layer of LLCs. Now I should probably plead guilty to an oversight. I started dating Michelle a couple years after I came out of my post-divorce depression and returned to the company. It's a wonder I managed to have a social life at all. However, we hit it off from the start. Perhaps our shared experience of divorce was to blame, although I was frank from the start about why Janet had divorced me, albeit under unclear circumstances. I didn't tell her that she worked for a company that in turn was connected to a controlling interest owned by my family company. I was going to, but frankly never did. When I missed the opportunity to tell her about it, too much time had passed and I just didn't feel comfortable mentioning it. Plus, I never thought it would be a problem. I didn't get directly involved in all of this until, sitting at the cluttered kitchen table with Michelle's divorce petition in hand, I thought of her lying in that man's bed and wondered how many times before this week she had fooled me like a fool. The petition was pretty simple. We shared a household property, but she owned her house and I owned my newly acquired cottage in the mountains. Clean and simple. All it took was a phone call. Dawn, it's Nathan. Since she served me last night, is there nothing stopping us from doing what we discussed? Don was my attorney handling personal legal matters, and I had spoken to him the day before. Well, let's be clear again. What is your income on your W-2 form for the last 5 years? $52,000 a year before taxes, and not a penny more. And how much does Michelle make? She makes about $120,000 to $140,000, not counting performance bonuses. If we pull the trigger, Nathan, she'll be sucking grapes for a week. Right now, I don't care. So, the next day, the triggers to escalate my divorce war were pulled. On Friday morning, Michelle Becker and Dan Mosey were fired for violating company morals and fraternity rules. Michelle was given severance pay in accordance with the rules. Dan was fired and escorted out the door under guard. That same day, Caroline Mosey got Dan served with a divorce suit and kicked out of the house. They were both facing an expensive trip to the beaches. I didn't have to do any tricks with transferring money to different accounts, canceling credit cards and the like. We each had our own. At the end of the day, I sat in my lawyer's office, sipped a $300 an hour cognac, and signed all the papers agreeing to Michelle's terms. One of his receptionists took a stack of papers to the courthouse to file before closing. For pawning a bitch, or should I say a couple bitches, getting divorced, finding a new home, and losing $15,000 on a divorce lawyer in 1 week, I told my lawyer and friend. I went back to my empty apartment and cried for the first time since my first divorce. 6 months later, I picked up a copy of the final judgment and put it in a safety deposit box. Next chapter. After burning Michelle, as I called it almost a year ago, I slept with Jeanette 4 times, not counting that night. The aftermath of the burning was very unflattering. Michelle still lives in her expensive house and works at a competing firm not far from my office, albeit with much less remuneration. As a subordinate in the office affair, Hawthorne Financials paid her 6 months severance pay, and she waived any rights to contest her termination. Things were not going well for Dan Mosey. He had suffered his 3rd defeat in the marriage, and Caroline had scorched his ass in the divorce. She got their house to live in until their daughters reach 18 or graduate from college, whichever comes later. He pays alimony, child support, and has to give up half of his pension. As for work, he ended up taking a job as an assistant vice president of a regional bank in a shopping center, earning about half of what Hawthorne was paying him. I actually managed to see Caroline from time to time. She's taken a job with one of my engineering clients and does the bookkeeping. We've gone out to dinner a couple times, but it's platonic. Entertaining Dan's ex-wife would be too corny, although I'd be lying if I said I didn't think about it from time to time. Jeanette was in the kitchen making a cappuccino the morning after one of our pleasant evenings together when my doorbell rang. "Hi, Daddy." She stood with a hesitant smile, waiting to be invited in. Mom and I had named her Rose after Janet's mother, even though the dominant gene for redheadedness never showed up in her lineage. She had my hair and complexion, swarthy and tanned. I hugged her and invited her into the house. We hadn't seen each other in months, and even then there was a tension between us that I had no way of picking up on. "How are you, Rose? And what a nice surprise this morning." At that moment, Jeanette walked into the living room and introduced herself. If I thought it would be awkward, I was in vain. The two of them seemed at ease, but after a few minutes, Jeanette bowed out and informed me that she was going down to the pub for a while to make some inquiries. "Dad, I know I'm not here as often as I should be, and for that I'm sorry. I'd like to change that if I can." "Honey, you don't need to change anything. You're welcome here anytime, you know that." We chatted for a bit longer before she became much more serious. She seemed to hesitate for a moment before muttering, "Mom had a nervous breakdown and they put her in the hospital to get better." Some part of me wanted to exclaim, "Why the hell should I care? She hasn't said a word to me since the day she filed divorce papers when you were still 13 years old." But I didn't. In 8 years, the woman I'd been married to for 14 years never knew I still had blood flowing in my veins. "Rose, I'm sorry to hear that. What would you like me to do?" I didn't know what to expect in response, and what she said next discouraged me. "Mom wants you to visit her in the hospital." The last time I'd tried to talk to her was at Rose's high school graduation, and I wasn't sure what I was actually going to talk to her about. That's not really the case. There are a lot of topics I would have talked to her about years ago. For example, why couldn't she at least sit down with me and talk about what happened the night she found me in the hotel room? Only later did I find out that another couple had dropped off 2 very drunk partygoers in the room and left us to our fate. Unfortunately, neither I nor the femme fatale could remember how we got to the room or what we were doing there. When we woke up the next morning, we were both in the same bed and extremely surprised. She later told me that she didn't think we had done anything that night, but she couldn't say for sure. Rose, if you think it would be good for me to go see her, I'll do it for you. I can't imagine why she would even want to see me. Dad, I think this has been going on for a long time. When Carl died, Mom hardly ever left the house, and other than going to work every day, she never went anywhere, except to visit me at school sometimes. A couple of months ago, I came home and found her drunk and crying terribly. She wouldn't tell me what was going on, just kept saying everything was a mistake. Last week, a neighbor found her walking down the road at night wearing only her underwear and drinking heavily. The police put her in the hospital and kept her there with her permission all this week. A couple of days ago, she asked me to come and see if you could visit her. I assured Rose that I would come, and then bought her lunch at a nearby cafe and began to get into what was going on in her life. She was going to graduate from college with a degree in marketing, but she still hadn't found a job. Until then, she was going to continue working as a waitress downtown. After we parted ways, assuring me that I would indeed visit her mother, I crossed the street and sat down at the bar. No sooner had I placed my order than a tall IPA appeared in front of me. "So, are you and your daughter okay?" Jeanette asked. Asked Jeanette. Asked Jeanette. Asked Jeanette. Asked Jeanette. "Yeah, I think so. But damn it, her mom wants me to visit her. She's sitting in the insane ward at the hospital downtown. The same one who squeezed the balls out of you and tried to send you to an almshouse? The one and only. Lucky you." She grinned and went to the bar to wait for a couple customers. Sunday afternoon, I was as ready as I could be. I always dress well, but this was my casual look, jeans and a pullover. As I reached for the doorknob, my mouth went dry and I fumbled for a mint in my pocket. It was a 10-minute drive to the hospital, and it felt like I'd been staring into the abyss for half my life, or at least 8 years. I don't know why I felt that way. In the last year, I'd managed to get into a second marriage, flush it out, and become comfortable in my own skin. The dryness returned when the elevator came into view, and I chewed on a soft mint, hoping the commercial burst of flavor would erase the cotton candy. It was one of those glass elevators that are outside, and the ground goes out from under your feet as you go a few floors up. Eventually, it slowed down and then stopped, and the door opened. I was very surprised. It didn't look like a hospital room at all, and certainly not like a cuckoo's nest. On the contrary, it was like a cozy house with soft furniture and paintings on the walls. I entered the ward, and a stocky nurse led me to the residence where Janet lived. The nurse didn't know my medical history or the adventures between patient and visitor, except that I was on the visitors list and everything was fine. I can't describe the feeling with which I approached her and saw her before she saw me. 4 years ago, she had been a devoted wife to another man and didn't want to hear a word from me. That was the last time I had seen her until that moment. She still looked attractive, although the hospital clothes didn't emphasize her figure. She had lightened her hair from natural strawberry blonde to a short cut. "Hi, Nathan. Thanks for coming." There was a smile in her eyes, but at the same time sadness or pain, I couldn't tell. "Hi, Janet. It's good to see you." I didn't know if it was true or not, but it felt like the right words at that moment. We didn't hug, and I didn't greet her like a long-lost friend. Hell, I shook her hand like a business associate. Damn weird. "Sabe, hell of a place to meet after all these years, isn't it?" she said, with a tinge of wistful irritation. It was obvious she was trying to keep her cool. I guess this isn't the place I'd be looking for if I wanted to have a beer and a chat." I tried to break the veil hanging over the conversation. "Well, they make a good iced tea, and not of the Long Island variety." She smiled again, a spark of life in her eyes. "I asked Rose to see if she could invite you over, and I know it seems strange after all the silence we've kept all these years, but it was necessary. Both I and my doctor agree." She paused briefly after that and then continued. "I think you already know that I've completely lost my mind, or I wouldn't be sitting here, would I?" Rose saw it coming, but I let it get out of hand. I guess there's a reason for that, but not an excuse. "Nathan, the first thing I have to do is apologize to you for the way I acted. I know that at some point I will need to explain the circumstances of why I reacted the way I did, but now is not the place for that." I'd like to do it later in a more appropriate setting than this one. But I want you to know that I'm sorry I couldn't sit down and talk to you at the end. I almost killed myself last week. I couldn't carry around the guilt of it all. Instead, I drank myself into a stupor and hoped someone else would do it with a car or something. How stupid of me. It would have devastated Rose. Janet, the important thing is that you got help before this could happen. And I know Rose is very worried right now. She came in yesterday morning and we talked for a long time and then we went to lunch. She's a nice girl. I'd say you've been wonderful in guiding her through adolescence. She thanked me for that and smiled warmly. Yeah, she's a great kid. Heck, she's already a woman, but I sure messed up her life. I guess the fact that I'm your doppelganger didn't help. You know, Carl kept trying to tell me I wasn't acting right, but he was always a gentleman and never interfered. Janet quickly looked away. Tears filled her eyes and she hastily pulled herself together before turning back around. Carl was a good guy, Janet. I was sorry when I found out what happened at the plant. Yes, I know, Nathan. Rose told me you offered everything we needed, and yet I remained as cold as ever. I will regret that forever. And I'm sorry about your divorce, Nathan. I know it was painful. Nay, we talked for a few more minutes about Rose and what was going on in her life, and I got ready to leave. So what's next for you, Janet? I'm going to stay here for a few more days, as my doctor advised. When I get home, I'm going to slow down a bit. If you agree, I'd like to meet you sometime to talk about what happened to us, Nathan. I need to talk it out, and you have a right to hear it, even after all these years. Could we do that? She looked at me hopefully, and I didn't know what I wanted out of this, so I compromised. We'll see. Let's get you cleaned up first and make sure Rose is okay, and then we'll make our move, okay? As I rode the elevator downstairs, I realized that this whole day really had been an anticlimax. She was sorry it had ended this way, that it had driven her crazy and put her in the insane asylum ward. I think I burst into laughter before I even got down to the first floor. It sounds callous, but it really was funny. I had to wipe tears from my eyes as I made my way to the car. Jeanette and I had grown a little closer over the past couple months, and I loved being around her. She became a thinking board for me, and I became the same for her. She was wiser than her 35 years would suggest, and I valued her opinion. In the morning, I would make her breakfast, blueberry pancakes and English sausages, and she would head to her pub about the same time I went to the office. I needed to go out of town for a few days on business, so I asked Rose to keep me posted on how her mom's case was progressing. By the time I got back at the end of the week, Janet had already been discharged, and Rose was spending a lot of time at the house, working on the recovery, if any. I think she just wanted to be near her mother for a while. Daddy, are you coming to my graduation? Yes, ma'am. I hadn't forgotten about it, but I hadn't thought about it either. It would also entail another meeting with her mother. Of course not, honey. And when you're ready, I want to talk to you about work. Do you mind? Yeah, I don't mind, but you know what I want to do, don't you? Also, Mom will be there, just so you know. Rose wanted to work in a startup, and we usually had one or two businesses in the planning and possibly startup stages. It would give her quick training and experience, and if she was willing to work hard, it would be a good way to break into the business world. Janet, on the other hand, wanted something completely different, and I don't know if I was ready for that. Look, what's the worst that can happen? She'll say she's sorry, that she should have talked to you and now you'll all be cronies again. Jeanette burst into unrestrained laughter. I mean, seriously, aren't you wondering why you were kicked like a sick mule? I guess she had me figured out. For 8 years, I'd wondered why she'd turned her back on me like that, but there was a lot of water under the bridge she'd set on fire. I also knew that I could have. Just might have had fun with that Spanish hottie, but it wouldn't have justified a nuclear explosion if I hadn't taken the time to at least detach myself a little to realize what had and hadn't happened. The prom went off without a hitch, and the three of us even had a drink together when it was over. Janet looked a lot better than when I'd seen her at the hospital, but there was still an irritability in her that she tried to hide. In the presence of an outsider, it might have passed, but I knew it was better this way, even after all this time. Nevertheless, it led to the next steps. It had been a long 8 years since I had pulled into the driveway of the old two-story colony I called home. Old Mr. Green Jeans still lived across the street. Rose had given him that name when she was little because he looked like a character from old reruns of Captain Kangaroo. Mrs. Wilson, the widow, still lived next door, though I heard she was infirm by now. The lawn was well tended, Someone had done some work in the garden on the side of the house, but otherwise it looked pretty much the same as the last time I left it, right down to the forest green shutters. I pressed the doorbell, and a familiar long chime sounded in the foyer. Janet opened the door to her house, and we awkwardly froze for a moment before I stepped across the threshold. I almost didn't. All I could think about was my last step back. "Thank you, Nathan, for stopping by my place," she said, inviting me inside. God, I could still see the marks we'd carved into the door frame leading into the kitchen to measure Rose's height. This is going to be harder than I thought. Most of the furnishings had changed, but the familiarity of the house overshadowed any changes our fractured lives might have imposed on what had been our first and only home together. I had to keep reminding myself that this was another man's home, at least temporarily. And I, like him, had entered another woman's home for the marriage season. It was like a bad television script when Janet invited me to sit at the kitchen table I knew so well. I poured the beer she gave me into a mug and settled into the chair that had been mine for so long. She was still drinking the white wine. "Well, I guess that's what I asked for. And now that I have you, I'm still trying to figure out how to get started." She tried to laugh, but it failed. "All right, Janet, why don't you just tell me how you've been doing lately? Are you still working at the Squirrel?" "Yes, although about a year ago they transferred me to Crosstown to run their new store. I'm doing well there. I'll have worked for them for 20 years by spring. They've been good to us. Rose worked for them in school." We talked mostly about the ordinary things in our lives, and I felt that she knew more about me than I knew about her. She brought me up to speed by telling me about a few of our old friends and neighbors. I hadn't talked to old friends much since most of them had chosen opposite sides during and after the divorce. "Nathan, I think I should cut to the chase. I think it was Carl who pressed me the hardest and I didn't listen to him. In hindsight, I can say he was right. You deserved to be treated like a man, and I acted like you didn't exist. It ruined Rose's life, and to tell you the truth, it ruined me even more. Carl always said only good things about you. You know he really did. And he always convinced me to find a way to forgive you, to sit down and have a real talk with you. He wasn't threatened by anything. God knows I should have listened to him. He showed up a couple years after we broke up and was one of the few people who saw right through me as an abused woman. Somehow, he broke down the barriers I had erected after several failed attempts to get back on stage." She smiled slightly and continued. "When he was killed at the factory, I pretty much shut myself off and was all about work and making sure Rose was on top of things. Carl and I had a good marriage, but it was more like we liked each other terribly. I needed a man, and I didn't want to cohabitate with Rose, who was a teenager and all, so we got married. Damn, I talk too much about Carl and not enough about why I want you here." She filled her glass with wine. "Janet, what caused the breakdown? I mean, that's the most important thing, isn't it?" "Yes, it is. Do you remember James Solomon? He was your father's personnel officer, and you kept him on as a consultant. He often stopped by your house when you had a busy schedule. But what you didn't know was that he often stopped by your house when you were on the road with clients. Or, why didn't you tell me about this when we got married?" "I don't really know, Nathan. I guess I knew I could handle it. I wasn't going to go to bed with him, but the attention was nice. You were gone half the time, and he'd come over on one excuse or another. We'd have coffee and talk business, but I wasn't stupid. I knew he was looking for fun, but, like I said, failed every time. Anyway, he was the one who told me where to find you that night. Hell, he had a key to the room and he warned me about what you were doing. So when I turned the key in the lock and walked in, I wasn't completely surprised, though in fact what I saw just stunned me. I realized that our marriage was over. I don't know how much you remember it today, but a woman pressed her face and lips right against your things, and you both passed out from what seemed to be a night of debauchery. I completely lost my head. With all the opportunities I had had over the years, I had never once had fun with another man, and I felt completely humiliated. I considered the scorched earth method as the only way out, especially when James told me that it wasn't the first time that you did it all the time, that it was common knowledge among the counselors and even some of our friends. You can see for yourself what came of it. As for James, he ended up getting what he wanted after I sued him, and now I feel like shit about it. But he ended up being a waste of time. This went on for about a month and we broke up. He wanted to keep it quiet since he was still working for you, but I was sick of him by then. I sipped my beer, listening and watching her. I remembered that James had left a few months after that incident, though I attributed it to him being unhappy with my alleged affair. I had no idea he had been having fun with Janet in my absence. She continued, I refuse to forgive you for that, and you know the rest, at least until a few months ago. I got a call from a woman named Susan Solomon, James's widow. He had died of pancreatic cancer a few weeks before, and before he died, he had written some letters to people that he asked them to pass on after his passing. James had become a born-again Christian, and, according to Mrs. Solomon, he needed to confess to several people he felt had been wronged throughout his life, and I was one of them. She wanted to give me a letter. When she found out that I was married to you, she informed me that I had a letter for you as well, and we agreed that I would give it to you personally. She handed me a small white envelope across the table. James's confession led to my ultimate breakdown, and you know what came of it. Mrs. Solomon was convinced that James was truly remorseful for what he had done to us, and by the time he realized what he had to do, he was too ill to travel. What did he do, Janet? He set it up, everything. He and his friends spiked the drinks you and Mrs. Lucas were drinking, and when the time came, took you to a hotel room and positioned you, so that I would know what you were doing when I entered the room. He said they had planned to do it with Mrs. Lucas, but they ran out of time and didn't have time to get me back to the room. The whole thing was a damn setup, and I ended up ruining my marriage. Mrs. Lucas had separated from her husband by then, so there were no repercussions for her, but he said he wrote her a letter of apology. Janet wept quietly, and I sat there digesting her words. It was a dead man's confession of events that had long since died. I didn't need to read it. He did all this to entertain you? I asked in amazement. Yes, and then went on to another conquest. Did you ever think that all you had to do was to sit down with me, as you are doing now, and ask all the questions you needed to ask? Those 12 hours of my life, from the moment I showed up at the corporate party until I woke up in the hotel room with Marcella, are indelibly imprinted in my memory from the very night they happened. Neither of us remembered a single thing after 1 o'clock in the morning. I knew you and a few other women were busy at the party and didn't pay much attention. We were all drinking. Janet, in all the time we've been married, I've never once cheated on you willingly. And for 8 years, it's been killing me to think that I might have done it in a drunken stupor. And yet I never had a chance to defend myself or do anything to save my marriage. I loved you like no one else for all those 14 years, and overnight, it was all swept away. Not only that, you hurt me to the max for something I had absolutely no recollection of. Have you ever read Kafka? That was the state I was in for 6 months until my sister sat me down at the table and read me the riot act. The only connection to my past life was visiting Rosa, and I suppose I can be grateful for that. Her eyes were red with tears. I didn't need any revelation to realize that she had always been wrong, and even before this latest revelation, she knew it too, and that made me even angrier. Perhaps that was what had pushed her into the cuckoo's house, the realization of her grave sin. Do you remember the first time we saw this house, I asked, trying to put some levity into the situation? She nodded in response. I always thought it was too big, but as soon as we moved in, before Rose even showed up, I fell in love with it. I remember carving the first notch in it when she was about 2 years old. The memory broke through the anguished expression on her face and brought a slight smile. I've forgiven you, Janet. I left all I could when you and Carl got back together and I started dating seriously again. The only thing I still carry with me is the pain of not being able to be there every day while my baby girl grew up and became a woman in her own right. Visits just can't cover that, I guess. Nathan, even though you never told me until now, I knew you had forgiven me back when Carl was here. I just didn't realize I had done anything wrong. It didn't come until after he was gone. Is there anything I can do to make things better between us? I didn't need to hesitate. Keep being a good mom to Rose and a good grandmother to the grandchildren she can give us, and I'll get another beer. She laughed and brought me another freshly frosted mug. So you're going to relive your episode? I asked her. It was part of it, but knowing that you forgave me helps me realize that I can handle it. I sat at the wheel for a while, reflecting on our conversation and the revelations about how my first marriage had collapsed, and realized that someone had been stirring shit in the cauldron and I had been the wand, but now he was just worm fodder. On another note, I'm having lunch with Rose and Janet next week. Next chapter. Have you entertained her yet? Jeanette asked half seriously as we were cooling off after one of our usual walks. I'm not going to. That's what I thought too. I had no desire to. You have lunch with her a couple times a week, she said with a smirk. Maybe, but I never have lunch. About the lunches, she was exaggerating. It was usually once a week, and usually Rose was with us. I think Janet still felt that behind all this therapeutic mishmash, there was a sliver of optimism that she could rekindle something between us. By no means was I urging her to do so, but it was pretty damn clear to me that the hope for shit ship had sailed years ago. Besides, I liked what Jeanette and I had. We enjoyed going out to dinner, going to the movies or a concert, even playing ball on occasion. And just as importantly, our compatibility in the bedroom was incomparable to any other relationship I'd ever been in, including my two ex-wives. We had just sat down at a table at the Oak, a high-end steakhouse downtown, when I saw her walk into the dining room holding the hand of the managing director of one of our competitors, the very firm Michelle had worked for since I had fired her almost 2 years ago. They sat down so that Michelle and I were in direct line of sight of each other from across the hall. Now all you need, cowboy, is for the resident mental health counselor to come in and sit behind you. Jeanette tried to suppress a laugh, but she was having great difficulty doing so. Knock it off, devil, I joked. I knew this guy, the obnoxious jerk who got caught and was rumored to have been paid a lot of money to keep it quiet. Of course, this is all insider information since none of this has been made public. John Marshall is his name, and he and I have been like water and butter over the years. Michelle knew the story, and perhaps that explained the condescending smirk that appeared on her lips whenever her gaze happened to stop on me. She recognized who had burned her at Hawthorne, though I tried to keep a low profile. Apparently, John Marshall had become her new meal ticket, and she was clearly showing it. This was not a business dinner for the two of them. He showered her with affection, and she teased him. As far as I could tell, Michelle had found herself a new boss to have fun with on her way up the career ladder. Whether Mrs. Marshall #2 would approve of this slut remained to be seen. You're up to something, I know it for a fact, Jeanette said, interrupting my devious thoughts. I only smiled at her intuition. I had something to smile about. Mrs. Marshall was on her second marriage to good old John, and I was sure Michelle had no idea that Cheryl Marshall was the sister of none other than Caroline Roberts, the former Mrs. Caroline Mosey. It's a small world after all. Cheryl's late first husband worked for the same firm as John and was its managing director when Marshall was first hired. The couple were well thought of, and after his death, the company set up a memorial scholarship for local school children. You could call it coincidence or just the fact that I'd been around the block a few times before, but I had a hunch that one ex-wife would need the services of a headhunter if things were going in her favor. I think it was called flipping a coin, back in the days when payphones were still in vogue. A couple months later, I learned from Caroline that her sister had filed for divorce from John Marshall and named Michelle in the suit. It went pretty quietly, but a few weeks after that, Michelle put her cherished house up for sale. I almost decided to make a phantom bid for it, but Janet, of all people, talked me out of it. What are you going to do with it when she leaves town? She asked. She asked seriously. She asked seriously. Probably sell it again. Great. She'll take your money, unbuckle her burden and leave, and you'll be left holding the bag. I thought you were smarter than that, Nathan Becker. I thought so too, and agreed to give up on the stupid idea. A couple months later, Michelle sold her trophy house, accepting a lower price than she had originally offered. Sometimes it's good to have friends in real estate. She ended up moving a couple hours south in search of a new career ladder to mess around on. Before she left, I cornered her in a booth at the Ruby Tuesday restaurant during lunch. She was alone, or I never would have approached her, but for once I wanted answers to questions I probably already knew the answer to. Michelle, it's a pleasure to see you in this exquisite establishment, I said, sitting down across from her. She looked furious, but I just held up my hands and said, peace offering. It was total bullshit. I didn't care if she calmed down or not, I just wanted answers. Something, have you come to gloat over your bloody victory, Nathan? Well, to hell with the world then. No, Michelle, I'm just looking for a simple explanation, that's all. Just tell me why and why you did it the way you did. It took me a long time to think she would answer, but she didn't have the guts to shut up and say the sensible thing. You want me to tell you how lousy you are? Okay, you suck in bed. Satisfied? I just laughed. sipped my tea, and laughed some more. A perplexed expression appeared on her face, and then she just sighed. Okay, so you're not that bad. In fact, you're not bad at all. You're damaged goods, Nathan. Very damaged goods. What the hell do you mean? What the hell does that mean? You ditched me, threw all my shit away, locked me up, and didn't even sit down with me to discuss it? Screw you, you're spoiled. I realized I was talking louder than I should have and lowered my voice. Jesus Christ, you really don't know, she said. Do you know how many times you screamed her name in your goddamn dream? More times than I can count. Janet. Nathan, you still love that damn woman. Why you married me, I'll never know. Why did I do what I did? I don't know. In retrospect, I probably should have just filed the papers and rode off into the sunset. For that matter, I didn't have any fun with Dan until the night his wife found us, or anyone for that matter. The next day I tried to call you to see if there was a way to bridge the burned bridge, but you weren't answering your cell phone. And when Caroline told me how she found out about it, I realized I was wasting my time. Michelle, I never realized I mentioned her name while I was sleeping. I wish you had told me. If anything, I don't love her, not like I used to. There was a lot of baggage and open questions that were never resolved, you know that. I suppose I was, and probably still am, damaged goods, but not because of what you thought, but because of the same things you did to me. A perplexed expression appeared on her face for a few moments, and then the damn bitch just smirked. You don't know it, but you're in love, Nathan. You've never stopped being in love with her. You're like a badass Mickey Rourke trying to hide her in some bartender. Jeanette is not your love, Nathan, and neither am I. Your wife is Jeanette, and she will always be until you die. To you, I'm a whore who left you for a quick run to the top, but you're wrong. I'm just a woman who was faithful to her husband until she realized it didn't have to be that way. Yes, I looked at Marshall as the ticket, but he came to me on his own. I didn't run after him, and truth be told, he was messing with me about his marriage, or I wouldn't have touched him. Same with Dan. I took him at his word. But screw it all. It's water under a burned bridge now, isn't it? I took a sip of my drink and just nodded. Maybe I'll see you again, Nathan. With those words, she left, and I was left sitting there feeling like I had just been handed a hat along with the bill. I don't even like Mickey Rourke. Screw her, she's wrong. That didn't stop me from watching from the window as she walked to her car and wondering if there wasn't a shred of truth to all of this. Next chapter. Sometimes Rose would cancel and Janet and I would have lunch somewhere downtown, usually reminiscing about Rose's younger years. Eventually, I'd return to the office, angry at the world for taking those years away from me. Janet didn't seem to notice it, and neither did Rose. One afternoon, I lost my temper and took my frustration out on Janet. Later that evening, I called her and apologized and felt good about it. I guess it was a kind of valve release. Jeanette called it a fight. Saya, if you take her candy, she'll probably make you dinner, babe. You two already look like a married couple, just not entertaining each other yet, she said, leaning back in her chair to savor our date. There have been times like that, you know the story. Yes, I do, but I can see the signs. Until then, I'll keep you. I liked being kept like that, and I showed her my appreciation every chance I got. What I didn't like was the conflict. I felt Rose was pressuring me, and Janet was covering it up. Even Jeanette seemed to be agreeable to some events in which I had no part. I had to act. Rose, here's your chance. We have an opening in the new Atlanta office, and I'd like you to take it. I'll have to move, Dad. I know, but it's only for a couple years, and then I'd like to bring you back and put you in charge of all these functions here. I have a couple of retired guys who will be retiring around the same time, and this will prepare you for that possibility. She mulled over the offer for a few days and finally accepted the job. Rose worked in our Windy Hill office in Atlanta for a couple months before I had lunch with Janet again. I used that time to spend as much time as possible with Jeanette and see where our relationship might go. The fact that Rose worked out of town gave me an excuse to cut back on the number of lunches. If I thought that ridding Rose of her role as mediator between me and her mother would resolve my own conflicted feelings, I was wrong. Nathan, you have to come. You're the one she asked for. Janet was throwing a farewell party for Mrs. Wilson from across the street, who was moving in with her daughter in Connecticut instead of settling in a nursing home in another part of town. The parish is small. Her 2 daughters, Old Man Green Jeans, and a few other neighbors from this street. You can take Jeanette with you too. I thought for a while and agreed to come the following Saturday afternoon. By all means, I was going to bring Jeanette with me. It would allow me to go outside in the nice weather. She didn't want to go at first, but I tried to bring a smile to her face and she agreed. We arrived around 1 o'clock. The backyard was fully decorated, and the guest of honor, smartly dressed, was sitting in a wicker rocking chair. Old Mrs. Wilson was well into her 80s, but she always remained a beautiful woman, even when dementia set in. The big surprise was that Rose was here too, having arrived the night before. We introduced ourselves to each other and everyone went into party mode. And I, along with the husbands of several of the neighbors, started helping to grill. Jeanette chatted with the other guests and I chatted surprisingly relaxed with another couple and Janet. We were all laughing and having a good time, and I didn't notice Jeanette watching us, at least not until I thought about it later. When it was time to leave, we all agreed that we would do it again and keep in touch. Jeanette was pretty quiet that night, and when it was time to call it a night, she went to her room instead of staying up to sleep with me. I didn't pay much attention to it at the time, just figured that Saturday nights were usually spent together. The next day, she came back and blasted me. "Snut, Nathan, I'm going to try to put our relationship on hold for a while. I need some space." Okay, I decided to give her some space. "That's okay, Jeanette. I have a few projects I need to finish up over the next few months." I know I'm not the brightest bulb, and when she kissed me goodbye, I never realized anything. It wasn't until I came back after work on Monday and saw that she had moved all her stuff out of the apartment that it hit me. She'd gone, left me. I wanted to go to the pub and talk to her, but pride got in the way. Before I could let go of that thought, the phone rang and it was Janet. "Hey Nathan, would you like to have a drink with me at Charlie O's, my treat?" she asked enthusiastically. At first I was going to turn her down, but I agreed and headed out the door. When I came out, she was already there, chatting animatedly with two other couples, and they were all laughing. "Nathan, come here," she shouted. "Let me introduce you to my friends from work." She introduced them, and it turned out that Janet had been promoted at work, and we started celebrating. All in all, we had a great time, and before I knew it, we were out the door. Janet left her car there and I drove her, considering she was well over the limit by then. When we pulled up to the house, she asked me to stop by for at least a cup of coffee. Thinking back on it now, I realize it was better that way. Her inhibitions were loosened, I knew how she felt about me, and the newly abandoned libido in me demanded satisfaction and reinforcement. And I didn't know what to say when we were done, so I didn't say anything and we just hugged. The next thing I knew, it was 3 in the morning and I knew I had a 10 o'clock flight to catch. I made the flight to Atlanta on time and spent the day at the office where Rose worked. They had just finished an external audit and we had off-site conferences with an accounting firm in the afternoon. In the evening, I had dinner with Rose at the Buckhead restaurant. "Dad, I understand you went out with Mom last night. She was worried you wouldn't be here in the morning until I told her you had to be here tonight." A sly smile appeared on her face, as if she had been privy to the mystery of the cat that killed the canary. "Yes, but it could have been a mistake, Rose. We were both drunk and otherwise it wouldn't have happened." "What nonsense, Papa. I saw it in your faces on Saturday. That's why Jeanette was leaving. She saw it too." I paused in my drink at that remark but was silent for a moment. "Jeanette told you she was leaving?" Now the pause hung on Rose's lips, and she didn't know what to answer. When you don't know how to get out of it, sometimes it's better to keep silent. She should have kept silent. "She told me about it at the party when we were watching you and Mommy. We both saw it, Daddy." I could see her confidence waning a little, but I didn't say anything to alarm her, just confirmed what she already knew. "Yes, Jeanette and I have decided to give each other our freedom, and I suspect that's more important to her than it is to me. So yes, she left. I didn't really feel like talking further, so I brought the conversation back to work and we discussed the audit results for a while longer. The next morning I had a return flight to catch, and then I was off to see a client for 2 weeks. In the evening I lay in bed going over in my mind all that had happened in the last few days and realizing that I had been played with, but well, Janet and Rose, old roommates, and Jeanette were there to witness all the good times. Those were good times too, but really it was nostalgia. The backyard party and grilling was nostalgia. I caught my return flight and tried to stop by the pub to catch Jeanette, but to no avail. She didn't show up for her morning exercise, and one of her parents said she was taking the rest of the week off. I ended up flying to Houston for a 2-week engagement. I left her a couple messages, but she never responded, and I didn't push for fear of seeming rude to her. I decided I would just wait until I got back. I flew into town on Friday afternoon, and when I walked into the pub, one of the new barmaids informed me that she had gone out for the evening with a friend. Having said that, she winked, and my heart quietly broke. She didn't know we were a couple until a couple weeks ago. Janet called me regularly after our night together, and I took her calls when I was free, but never got personal. I wasn't ready to tell her it was a mistake, and I didn't know how to do that yet. As a result, I got caught up in work. It's an old habit. I've done it twice now after each divorce. Both Janet and Rose gave me freedom, and I think it was because Rose talked to her mother and maybe they questioned their scheme. The scheme was what it was. Invite Jeanette over to see how well Janet and I were doing together. It worked, but it didn't have the desired consequences, and after a couple more weeks, I think they figured it out. Jeanette handed over the running of the pub to one of her longtime employees, and herself went on an extended vacation to Europe with whoever her new friend was. By then, I had been depressed for a month and decided to put it down to life's troubles. I hated not going to the pub, but I found a brew pub a short walk in the other direction, and it became my regular spot whenever I wanted to chat over a pint. One evening, as I was heading out for my usual pint of beer, I passed a restaurant I used to frequent before it changed ownership. For whatever reason, I decided to stop by there and see if I could grab a bite to eat at their bar. My beer had just arrived, and I was about to order off the menu when I caught a glimpse of them. Jeanette was sitting at a small table with a man I hadn't seen before, in a rather intimate setting. It was clearly a dinner date. She didn't notice me, though I never stopped noticing her. I decided not to order, and after a quick sip of beer, threw a couple bills on the bar and quietly left. To make up for my misery, I ordered a tall IPA and chicken fingers at the place I came to. There was some sort of game playing on the screen at the end of the bar, and I immersed myself in it, devouring the empty calories. I think it took me an hour to eat my order. I didn't even hear her sit down next to me. "Is this your new place?" she asked with a half smile on her lips. "Yeah, it looks like it. The beer is good, and the seat is comfortable. How are you doing, Jeanette?" "All right, I guess. I took a vacation to figure out what I'm supposed to be, and I still don't know." She tried to squeeze out a nervous giggle, and to some extent she succeeded. "I saw you at the restaurant, Nathan, and noticed you were on your way here, so I thought I'd stop by and see how you were doing." "You ditched your date?" It was my attempt to inject some humor into the conversation. "Oh no," she laughed. "We came in our cars. I need to stop by the pub and start closing the books for the month." "Well, he's a good-looking guy. You've made a good reputation for yourself. I hope it works out for you, I really do." I tried to smile, but what came out instead was bewilderment. She was just laughing at me. "What's so funny?" I asked, and got serious too. She had to force herself to stop laughing before she could answer. "He's as queer as a $3 bill and he likes black boys." We both burst into unrestrained laughter and the ice was broken, even if she wasn't mine anymore. "Look, let me get you out of your newfound den and ask you to help me close my books this month. I'll buy you as much beer as you need." With those words, she led me to the pub. We finished by midnight and I went home, forgetting all my previous misery. At least I had a friend again. I was sipping an IPA one night, and after Jeanette finished wiping down the edge of the bar, she asked, "Why don't you ever bring Jeanette here? After all, she's always welcome." I'd started visiting the old pub 4 or 5 days ago, and Jeanette had never once entered the conversation. I just relegated her to topics we would just leave as is. I haven't seen Janet in over a month. She couldn't have looked more surprised than she did at that moment. But I thought that... I just shook my head. We've been played. She stepped away from the bar and we sat down in a booth. "What do you mean when you say we were pranked? I've seen what you two are like. I've seen people in love before. Hell, I've been in love myself." I sipped my beer and explained to her what this backyard meant to me, how important it was to me, how important the memories of us raising Rose as a child were. I knew most of the neighbors and was as relaxed as I hadn't been in a long time. Jeanette, I was relaxed because I was comfortable. My daughter was there, old neighbors, Mrs. Wilson. I was friends with my ex-wife, and I was in love. Why shouldn't I be relaxed and happy? "Then why aren't you with her?" I think the look of desperation on my face made her wonder, and then her hand flicked to her mouth. Oh my God, what have I done? She was crying quietly now. You didn't do anything, Jeanette. I just wasn't pure in my affections. Now I have to admit that I had fun with her on the sly, but I did it nonetheless and I regret it. But I can't change anything. You left me, and she seduced me. And by the time I realized what had happened, you had been gone for weeks and I realized I had lost you. Nathan, I did the same thing, only worse, for 2 weeks. And although I regretted it afterward, I hate my act even more now. How could I have been so stupid? I took her hand in mine and just stroked it, looking into her eyes. We were both idiots. Next chapter. We had set the date a couple weeks before, and by June of the following year, Jeanette was to be the third and final Mrs. Nathan Becker. After all the theatrics of the confusion period, we both realized we loved each other and we needed to stop pretending we were just friends with the best benefits. Janet didn't take it too well at first. She was mad as hell at me for not making a commitment. I explained to her that I loved Jeanette, that what we did was a bad decision on my part, and that I regretted entertaining her. I didn't just say that because deep down I didn't regret entertaining her. I just regretted the circumstances under which it happened. Eventually, she came to terms with it. Rose, on the other hand, sincerely apologized for what had happened. I had to assure her several times that it was okay. She will be a bridesmaid in the wedding. Michelle found another daddy in Savannah and is now the vice president of a real estate company doing commercial projects all over Georgia. The problem is, she's not his only lover. She just doesn't know it yet, but she's bound to find out. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, so subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.